The relationship between a parent and child is supposed to be sacred, built on trust, protection, and unconditional love. But what happens when that bond is shattered beyond repair? When the very person meant to nurture becomes a source of fear, and when a child, pushed to their absolute breaking point, makes a decision that will haunt them for the rest of their life. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Caroline Webster leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the teenager standing before her. At just 15 years old, Marcus Chen looked impossibly small in his oversized suit, his wrists bound in handcuffs that seemed designed for someone much larger. Behind him, his mother sobbed quietly, her face buried in her hands. Across the aisle, his father's family sat rigid with anger, their eyes burning with a demand for justice. "Marcus Chen," Judge Webster began, her voice measured but heavy with the weight of what she was about to pronounce. "The court has reviewed the jury's unanimous finding. Despite your age, despite the circumstances you claim led to this moment, the law is clear about the taking of a human life with premeditation and malice." She paused, letting the silence stretch across the packed courtroom. Every person present leaned forward, holding their breath. "You are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. You will die behind bars, Marcus. May God have mercy on your soul." But the question that would haunt this case for years to come wasn't about the sentence itself. It was about what really happened on the night of February 14th, 2019, in the Chen family home in Portland, Oregon. Was this a cold-blooded murder by a calculating teenager? Or was it the desperate act of a child who saw no other way out? The answer would depend on whose story you believed, and as the evidence unfolded, the truth became far more complicated than anyone could have imagined.
February 14, 2019, started like any other Thursday evening in the Chen household, at least according to neighbors who would later be interviewed by police. The two-story colonial home on Maple Street in the Eastmoreland neighborhood of Portland sat quiet in the winter darkness, smoke rising steadily from the chimney as temperatures dropped below freezing. Inside, 15-year-old Marcus Chen was in his bedroom, supposedly working on homework for his sophomore year classes at Franklin High School. His father, 48-year-old Dr. Richard Chen, a respected cardiac surgeon at Oregon Health and Science University, had arrived home from the hospital around 6:30 p.m., his usual time after a long shift. Marcus's mother, Linda Chen, had left earlier that afternoon to visit her sister in Seattle, a trip she made regularly to help care for her elderly aunt. This detail would later become crucial to the investigation, as it meant Marcus and his father were alone in the house that evening, with no witnesses to what would unfold in the hours that followed. The house, a well-maintained property valued at over $800,000, sat on a quiet street where families knew each other by name, and children rode bikes until streetlights came on. It was the kind of neighborhood where violent crime seemed impossible, where the worst thing that typically happened was a stolen package from a front porch. At approximately 9:47 p.m., a 911 call came into Portland Police Dispatch from Marcus Chen's cell phone. The call would later be played in court, its audio chilling in its calmness and clarity. "My father is dead," Marcus stated, his voice flat and emotionless. "I need someone to come to my house." The dispatcher, trained to remain calm in crisis situations, asked Marcus to repeat what he had said, perhaps not believing what she had heard. "My father is dead," Marcus repeated, using the exact same inflection and tone. "He's in the living room. There's a lot of blood. I think I should wait outside for the police." The dispatcher kept Marcus on the line, following protocol for potential homicide calls, asking him questions designed to assess the scene and determine if there was ongoing danger. When asked how his father had died, Marcus responded with unsettling precision. "He was stabbed multiple times with a kitchen knife. The dispatcher then asked the critical question that would echo throughout the investigation and trial. Who stabbed him, Marcus? There was a pause on the recording, lasting approximately 4 seconds, before Marcus answered in that same flat, affectless voice. I did. I stabbed my father.
The initial count by Officer Morrison identified 7 visible stab wounds to Richard Chen's torso, with additional defensive wounds on his forearms and hands that suggested he had tried to protect himself during the attack. A large kitchen knife, approximately 10 inches in blade length, lay several feet from the body, also covered in blood. The murder weapon, later identified as part of a knife set from the Chen's kitchen, showed no signs of being wiped clean, and Marcus's fingerprints would be found clearly impressed in the blood on the handle. The crime scene, despite its violence, showed no signs of struggle beyond the immediate area around the body. No furniture was overturned, no lamps broken, no indication of a chase through the house or a prolonged fight. As more officers and emergency personnel arrived, Marcus was read his Miranda rights on the front porch at 10:03 p.m., just 16 minutes after his initial 911 call. Officer Valdez would later testify that when she informed Marcus he had the right to remain silent and the right to an attorney, the teenager nodded and said, I understand. I'll cooperate fully. I want to tell you what happened. This immediate willingness to speak without a lawyer present would become a point of contention later, with Marcus's defense team arguing that a traumatized 15-year-old couldn't meaningfully waive his constitutional rights, while the prosecution would point to it as evidence of his calculated awareness of the legal system and his rights within it. Marcus was transported to Portland Police Central Precinct, where he was placed in an interview room designed for juvenile suspects, with cameras recording from multiple angles. Before any questioning could begin, however, protocol required that a parent or guardian be present for the interrogation of a minor. Linda Chen, Marcus's mother, was contacted by Oregon State Police while driving back from Seattle after being notified of her husband's death. She would not arrive back in Portland until nearly 3 a.m., meaning Marcus sat in the interview room for hours, occasionally provided with water and snacks, under the watchful eye of juvenile services personnel who documented his behavior during this waiting period. According to these observers, Marcus remained remarkably composed throughout the wait, never asking about his father's condition, despite not having been officially informed that Richard was dead, never crying or showing obvious emotional distress, and spending most of the time sitting perfectly still, staring at the wall. This behavioral observation would later be cited by prosecution psychiatrists as evidence of antisocial tendencies and lack of normal emotional responses, while defense experts would argue it was consistent with dissociative responses to extreme trauma. One juvenile services worker noted that Marcus asked only 2 questions during the entire waiting period. What will happen to me now? And will I be able to finish high school? The Chen family home, meanwhile, became a hive of activity as crime scene investigators documented every inch of the property. Detective Helen Park, a 20-year veteran of the Portland Police Bureau's homicide detail, was assigned as lead investigator on the case. Her initial walkthrough of the scene raised immediate questions that would shape the investigation. The violence of the attack, 7 stab wounds, including several to vital organs, suggested intense rage or fear, yet the rest of the house appeared undisturbed and orderly. Marcus's bedroom, searched as part of the initial investigation, was neat almost to the point of obsessiveness, with books arranged alphabetically, clothes folded precisely in drawers, and school supplies organized in labeled containers. More significantly, Detective Park noticed something in Marcus's bedroom that would become crucial evidence: a journal, sitting openly on the teenager's desk with an entry dated February 14, 2019, the day of the murder. The entry, written in Marcus's careful handwriting, contained words that would be read aloud in court and debated by experts. Today is the day everything changes. I can't live like this anymore. He won't stop. He'll never stop. I have to make it stop. I'm sorry for what I'm about to do, but I don't see any other choice. Maybe now Mom will finally be free, too." This journal entry, discovered within hours of the killing, immediately complicated the narrative. It suggested premeditation, which would elevate the charge from manslaughter to first-degree murder, but it also hinted at circumstances that might explain Marcus's actions. Detective Park made the decision to seize the entire journal as evidence, along with Marcus's laptop, phone, and school papers. What investigators would find in these items would paint a disturbing picture of life inside the Chen household, one that contradicted the family's public image of success and respectability. As dawn broke over Portland on February 15, 2019, the news of Dr. Richard Chen's death began to spread through the medical community and the Eastmoreland neighborhood. Colleagues at Oregon Health and Science University expressed shock and disbelief that the dedicated surgeon, known for his skill and precision in the operating room, had been killed by his own son. Neighbors described the Chen family as quiet and private, with few social connections, despite living in the community for over 8 years. Several mentioned that they rarely saw Richard and Marcus together, and that when they did, there was a noticeable tension between father and son. One neighbor, Patricia Morrison, who lived 2 houses down and had known the family since they moved to Maple Street, would later provide testimony that added context to the family dynamics. She recalled multiple instances over the years when she had heard shouting coming from the Chen house, always Dr. Chen's voice, never Marcus's. On one occasion, approximately 6 months before the murder, Patricia had been walking her dog past the Chen house around 10 p.m. when she heard what sounded like furniture being thrown, followed by Dr. Chen's voice yelling, "You're worthless. You'll never amount to anything." She had considered calling the police, but ultimately decided it was not her place to interfere in another family's private matters, a decision she told investigators she would regret for the rest of her life. The medical examiner's preliminary report, completed within hours of the body's arrival at the morgue, confirmed that Dr. Richard Chen had died from multiple sharp force injuries, with the fatal wound being a stab to the chest that penetrated his heart. The autopsy would reveal additional details that would become important to the case. Richard Chen had a blood alcohol content of 0.12, above the legal limit for driving, suggesting he had been drinking that evening. Toxicology would also show therapeutic levels of alprazolam, a medication prescribed for anxiety, in his system. These findings would support Marcus's eventual testimony about his father's state that evening, though they would not, in the prosecution's view, justify what Marcus had done. As Linda Chen finally arrived at the police station in the early morning hours of February 15th, accompanied by her sister, who had driven with her from Seattle, after being notified of her husband's death, she would need to be informed that her husband was dead and that her only child was being held as his killer, all while being asked to participate in her son's interrogation. The interview that followed, conducted with both Linda and a public defender present, as Marcus had officially requested legal representation upon his mother's arrival, would provide the first detailed account of what had happened in the Chen house that night, and why a 15-year-old boy felt he had no choice but to kill his own father.
The interrogation room at Portland Police Central Precinct was small and deliberately spare, painted in neutral beige with a table bolted to the floor and 4 chairs arranged around it. Cameras mounted in 2 corners captured every angle, their red recording lights a constant reminder that every word, every gesture, every facial expression would be preserved for future scrutiny. At 3:17 a.m. on February 15, 2019, Marcus Chen sat on one side of the table, his mother Linda beside him, tears streaming down her face as she clutched her son's hand. Across from them sat Detective Helen Clark and her partner, Detective Raymond Torres, both experienced in interviewing juvenile suspects in serious crimes. Also present was Marcus's newly appointed public defender, Jennifer Hartman,
a veteran of the Multnomah County Public Defender's Office who specialized in juvenile cases. Hartman had arrived at the precinct within 30 minutes of Linda Chen's call, despite the early hour, and had spent 20 minutes conferring privately with Marcus before allowing the interrogation to proceed. Her first instruction to her client had been simple: tell the truth, but I'll stop you if I think a question is improper or if I think you need a break. Marcus had nodded his understanding, his expression still maintaining that same unsettling calm that had characterized his demeanor since his arrest. Detective Park began the interrogation by establishing the basic timeline of the evening, asking Marcus to describe his day from the moment he woke up. Marcus complied, his voice steady despite the circumstances, explaining that he had attended school as normal, come home around 3:30 p.m., and spent the afternoon in his room doing homework. His mother had left for Seattle around 4 p.m., kissing him goodbye and reminding him there were leftovers in the refrigerator for dinner. Marcus stated that he had eaten alone in his room around 5:30 p.m., continuing to work on an essay for his English class about the theme of justice in To Kill a Mockingbird, a detail that would later strike many as grimly ironic. When his father arrived home around 6:30 p.m., Marcus said he had stayed in his room, hearing Richard move around downstairs, the familiar sounds of his father's evening routine, keys being dropped on the entry table, shoes being removed, the refrigerator opening and closing. Marcus testified that he had hoped to avoid any interaction with his father that evening, as he usually tried to do, preferring to remain in his room until he was certain Richard had gone to bed. This avoidance pattern, Marcus explained, had become his primary coping mechanism over the past several years, a way to minimize confrontations and the inevitable anger that seemed to erupt from his father with little warning or apparent cause. Around 7:30 p.m., Marcus continued, his father had called him downstairs. This summons filled Marcus with the familiar dread that had become a constant companion in his daily life, but he complied, knowing that ignoring his father would only make things worse. When he entered the living room, Marcus found Richard sitting on the sofa, a glass of what appeared to be whiskey on the coffee table, and a stack of papers spread out before him. These papers, Richard informed his son, were Marcus's most recent progress reports from school, which had been mailed home that week. Though Marcus's grades were solid, mostly A's with a few B's, Richard focused on a B+ in advanced algebra, a grade he deemed unacceptable for a son of his. He started the way he always started, Marcus told the detectives, his voice remaining oddly flat, as if he were describing something that had happened to someone else. He told me I was disappointing him, that I wasn't living up to my potential, that I was lazy and unmotivated. He said that with grades like these, I'd never get into a good college, never become anything worthwhile, never make him proud. Marcus paused, glancing at his mother who was weeping silently beside him. He said I was a waste of his genetic material, that I was proof that sometimes good stock produces defective offspring. He used those exact words, defective offspring. Detective Park, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the disturbing nature of the testimony, asked Marcus what happened next. Marcus explained that he had apologized, as he always did, promising to work harder, to do better, to be better. But apologies never seemed to satisfy Richard Chen. According to Marcus, his father stood up from the sofa and moved closer to him, and Marcus could smell the alcohol on his breath, stronger than usual. Richard had been drinking more heavily in recent months, Marcus noted, particularly on evenings when Linda was away and there was no one to moderate his consumption or witness his behavior toward his son.
What happened next, according to Marcus's account, followed a pattern that had been repeated countless times over the past several years. Richard began to berate his son more intensely, his voice rising, his language becoming more cruel and personal. He compared Marcus unfavorably to the children of his colleagues, bright students who excelled in everything they attempted. He mocked Marcus's interest in art and writing, dismissing these pursuits as worthless and feminine, insisting that Marcus should focus exclusively on mathematics and sciences if he hoped to follow his father into medicine. When Marcus tried to explain that he didn't want to be a doctor, that he had different interests and dreams, Richard's anger escalated dramatically.
He grabbed me by the shirt, Marcus stated, demonstrating by tugging at his own collar. He pulled me close to his face and told me that I didn't get to choose, that as long as I lived in his house, ate his food, enjoyed the life he provided, I would do exactly what he told me to do. He said I was his property, essentially, until I turned 18, and that he had invested too much money and time in raising me to allow me to throw it away on stupid dreams. Marcus's voice cracked slightly for the first time during the interrogation as he continued. Then he pushed me backward, hard enough that I stumbled and fell against the coffee table. Linda Chen's sobbing intensified at this point in the interrogation, and she turned to her son, whispering, "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell me it was this bad?" Marcus looked at his mother with an expression that managed to convey both love and frustration. "I tried to tell you, Mom, so many times, but you always said Dad was just strict, that he had high expectations because he loved me, that I needed to try harder to make him happy. You said things would get better if I just did what he wanted. But they never got better. They only got worse." Detective Park redirected the interrogation to the specific events of February 14th, asking Marcus to continue his account of what happened after his father pushed him back. Marcus stated that he picked himself up from the floor, his shoulder aching from the impact with the coffee table, and tried to leave the room, wanting only to retreat to his bedroom and avoid further confrontation. But Richard blocked his path, demanding that Marcus sit back down, that they weren't finished talking. When Marcus tried to move around his father, Richard grabbed his arm with enough force to leave bruises, physical evidence that would later be documented by police photographers and used by both the prosecution and defense to support their competing narratives. According to Marcus, his father forced him to sit on the sofa and then stood over him, continuing to enumerate Marcus's failures and shortcomings, his voice growing louder and more aggressive. Richard declared that he was done being patient with Marcus's mediocrity, that starting immediately there would be new rules in the house. Marcus would be removed from his art electives at school and enrolled in additional science courses. His after-school time would be dedicated entirely to studying, with no time for the creative writing he enjoyed. His internet access would be monitored and restricted to educational purposes only. His bedroom door would be removed to prevent him from hiding away when he should be studying. These new restrictions, while perhaps not illegal or physically abusive in themselves, represented to Marcus the complete elimination of any autonomy or personal space he had managed to preserve in his life. More significantly, according to his testimony, the way his father delivered these pronouncements suggested they were merely the beginning of even more severe consequences to come. He told me that if I didn't show immediate improvement, if I didn't prove to him that I was worth the investment he'd made in me, he'd make sure I understood what real disappointment felt like, Marcus said, his voice dropping even lower. He'd said things like that before, and they always preceded the worst incidents. When Detective Torres asked Marcus to clarify what he meant by worst incidents, the teenager hesitated, looking to his attorney for guidance. Jennifer Hartman nodded permission for him to answer. Marcus then described a pattern of escalating physical and emotional abuse that had characterized his relationship with his father for approximately the past 5 years since Marcus had entered middle school and begun to demonstrate interests and personality traits that diverged from Richard Chen's expectations and plans for his son. The abuse, Marcus testified, had begun with verbal berating and isolation punishments, evolved to include physical intimidation and occasional hitting, and had recently escalated to more severe physical violence that Linda Chen had not witnessed because Richard was careful to abuse Marcus only when they were alone. Marcus described an incident 3 months earlier, in November 2018, when he had received a B on a chemistry midterm exam. Richard had responded by forcing Marcus to spend an entire weekend copying chemistry formulas and definitions, forbidding him to eat until he had completed 100 pages of handwritten work. When his hand cramped and his writing became sloppy, Richard grabbed his hand and bent his fingers backward, threatening to break them if Marcus didn't improve his penmanship. Marcus had completed the assignment, his hand swollen and painful, but had told his mother he had jammed it in gym class when she asked about his inability to hold utensils properly at dinner the following Monday.
Another incident Marcus described occurred in January 2019, just weeks before the murder, when Marcus had accidentally spilled coffee on a medical journal Richard was reading. His father's response had been to grab Marcus by the throat and pin him against the kitchen wall, squeezing hard enough that Marcus struggled to breathe, while Richard told him that clumsy, careless people didn't deserve to take up space in the world. Marcus had hidden the bruising on his neck with high-collared shirts and strategic use of his mother's concealer makeup, skills he had developed over years of concealing evidence of his father's abuse. These revelations caused Linda Chen to cry even harder, repeatedly whispering, "I didn't know," though her lack of knowledge would later be questioned by investigators and social workers. Returning to the events of February 14th, Marcus testified that after his father finished outlining the new restrictions and punishments, Richard told him to go upstairs, pack his art supplies, and bring them down to be thrown away. This demand represented a breaking point for Marcus, as his artwork was one of the few remaining sources of joy and self-expression in his increasingly controlled and constrained life. Marcus stated that he tried to negotiate, promising to improve his grades without giving up his art, but Richard was unmoved. He said that if I wasn't going to comply voluntarily, he would drag me upstairs himself and destroy everything in my room that wasn't related to schoolwork, Marcus recalled. He said he should have done it years ago, that he'd been too soft on me, letting me waste time on frivolous activities. What happened next, according to Marcus's account, was a moment of sudden clarity that he described as both terrifying and liberating. Standing in the living room, facing another evening of abuse and the prospect of having the last vestiges of his autonomy stripped away, Marcus realized that this pattern would never end, that his father would never stop controlling and hurting him, that he had no real escape available to him. At 15, he couldn't leave home legally. He had tried to tell teachers and counselors at school about the problems at home, but his vague references to his father being strict and hard to please had not triggered any intervention. His mother, despite loving him, seemed incapable of standing up to Richard or even fully acknowledging the extent of his behavior. "I felt trapped," Marcus told the detectives, his voice taking on a quality of desperate explanation. "I felt like I was drowning and no one could hear me screaming for help. I thought about running away, but where would I go? I thought about killing myself, and I'd even started planning how I might do it in a way that wouldn't be too painful. But then I thought about my mom and how she'd be left alone with him and how guilty I'd feel leaving her in that situation. And I realized that the problem wasn't me. The problem was him. He was the one making our lives miserable. He was the one who needed to be removed from the equation, not me." This statement, delivered with a matter-of-fact tone that suggested Marcus believed he was simply describing a logical problem-solving process, represented the moment when his interrogation shifted from possibly supporting a manslaughter or self-defense claim to providing evidence of premeditated murder. Detective Park leaned forward, asking Marcus to be very clear about what he was saying. "Are you telling us that you decided in that moment that you were going to kill your father?" she asked. Marcus nodded. "Yes," he confirmed. "I decided that if he wasn't going to let me live, then he didn't deserve to live either. It seemed fair. It seemed like the only solution that would actually solve the problem." Jennifer Hartman, Marcus's attorney, intervened at this point, requesting a break in the interrogation to confer with her client. The recording shows the room being cleared of detectives while Hartman spoke urgently and quietly to Marcus, presumably explaining the serious implications of what he had just admitted. When the interrogation resumed 20 minutes later, Hartman announced that her client would continue to cooperate, but that she would be more actively monitoring the questions to ensure they were appropriate. Detective Park nodded her understanding and then asked Marcus to describe exactly what happened after he made the decision to kill his father. Marcus's account of the actual murder was chillingly detailed and delivered in the same flat, affectless tone that had characterized his entire interrogation. He stated that after deciding his father needed to die, he told Richard he would comply with the demand to bring down his art supplies. He went upstairs to his room, but instead of gathering his artwork, he retrieved a kitchen knife he had taken from the downstairs kitchen 3 days earlier and hidden in his desk drawer. This revelation that Marcus had taken the knife days before the murder was a crucial piece of evidence supporting premeditation and contradicting any potential argument that the killing was a spontaneous act during a heated confrontation.
"I pulled the knife out," Marcus testified, his voice remaining steady, even as his mother's sobs grew louder beside him. He saw it, and his expression changed. For the first time in years, he looked uncertain, maybe even afraid. He asked me what I was doing, told me to put the knife down, but I knew that if I put it down, nothing would change. He'd take the knife, probably hit me for threatening him, and things would just get worse. So I didn't put it down. I moved toward him, and he backed away, which was also new. He'd never backed away from me before. What followed, according to Marcus's detailed account, was a brief confrontation that ended with 7 stab wounds to Richard Chen's torso. Marcus described his father attempting to grab the knife, resulting in the defensive wounds on Richard's hands and forearms. Richard had called his son names during the struggle, Marcus recalled, telling him he was crazy, that he was going to regret this, that Marcus would never survive in the real world without him. These words, rather than deterring Marcus, seemed to strengthen his resolve. "Every word he said just reminded me of why I was doing this," Marcus explained. He couldn't even see that he was dying because of how he treated me. He was still trying to control me, still trying to make me feel worthless, right up until the end. The fatal wound, Marcus stated, was delivered when his father stumbled backward over the coffee table and fell to the floor. Marcus followed him down and stabbed him in the chest, feeling the blade sink deep, possibly penetrating Richard's heart, though Marcus claimed he didn't know anatomy well enough to have deliberately targeted specific organs. After the final stab, Marcus said he stood up and watched his father for several minutes, watching the blood pool around the body, watching Richard's breathing become shallow and then stop completely. Marcus claimed he felt nothing during these moments. No triumph, no guilt, no fear. Just a strange emptiness and a sense that a problem had been solved. Only after he was certain his father was dead did Marcus call 911, he explained, because he knew he needed to report what had happened and he wanted to control the narrative from the beginning. He changed out of his blood-soaked clothes into the fresh outfit police found him wearing, bagged the bloody clothes in a plastic trash bag, which was found in his closet during the initial search, and then sat on the porch to wait for police to arrive. This behavior, the cleanup and calculated management of the scene after the killing, further supported the prosecution's argument that Marcus had the presence of mind and intent that characterized first-degree murder rather than a heat of passion killing or legitimate self-defense. When Detective Torres asked Marcus if he regretted what he had done, the teenager paused for a long moment before answering. "I regret that it had to happen. I regret that my father was the kind of person who made me feel like I had no other choice. I regret that my mother has to live with this. But do I regret that he's dead, that he can't hurt me or control me anymore? No, I don't regret that at all." This answer, lacking the remorse that might have garnered sympathy from jurors and the public, would become one of the most frequently cited pieces of evidence that Marcus Chen was not a traumatized victim defending himself, but a calculating killer who had committed premeditated murder. The interrogation concluded at 5:43 a.m., nearly 2.5 hours after it began. Marcus was formally charged with first-degree murder and held without bail in a juvenile detention facility pending a hearing to determine whether he would be tried as an adult or remain in the juvenile justice system. Linda Chen, devastated by the loss of her husband and the arrest of her son, left the police station leaning heavily on her sister, facing the impossible task of planning a funeral while preparing to fight for her son's freedom. The detectives, meanwhile, began the process of building their case, gathering evidence that would either support or contradict Marcus's account of years of abuse leading to a desperate act of self-preservation.
In the days following Marcus Chen's arrest, Detective Helen Park and her team worked to verify the teenager's claims of long-term abuse at the hands of his father. This investigation would prove crucial in determining whether Marcus's actions could be justified, or at least explained by a pattern of victimization, or whether his testimony was a calculated attempt to garner sympathy and avoid responsibility for premeditated murder. The investigation took multiple tracks simultaneously, interviewing family members, friends, teachers, and neighbors, examining Marcus's school records and medical history, analyzing the physical evidence from the Chen home, and building a psychological profile of both victim and perpetrator. The first major discovery came from Marcus's journal, which Detective Park had seized from his bedroom on the night of the murder. The journal, a standard composition notebook with a black and white marbled cover, contained entries dating back approximately 2 years to Marcus's 8th grade year. What investigators found in these pages painted a disturbing portrait of daily life for a teenager living in fear. Early entries were relatively innocuous, typical teenage observations about school, friends, and minor frustrations with parental restrictions. But as the entries progressed chronologically, a darker pattern emerged. An entry from April 2017, when Marcus was 13, described an incident where Richard had criticized Marcus's performance in a school play, telling him that his acting was embarrassing and that he should quit theater to avoid further humiliation. Marcus wrote about feeling crushed by his father's words, noting that he had worked hard on the role and been proud of his performance until Richard destroyed that pride. Another entry from June 2017 detailed Richard's reaction to Marcus receiving an A- in Earth Science, which Richard deemed unacceptable because Asian students should always receive the highest grades. The racial element of Richard's expectations, putting intense pressure on Marcus to conform to model minority stereotypes, was a recurring theme throughout the journal. As the entries continued into 2018, Marcus's freshman year of high school, the incidents described became more explicitly abusive. An entry from September 2018 described Richard grabbing Marcus's face and squeezing hard enough to leave finger marks, angry that Marcus had been laughing with friends on the phone instead of studying. The entry included Marcus's observation that he would need to avoid certain facial expressions at school the next day to prevent anyone from noticing the marks. Another entry from October 2018 detailed an evening when Richard had forbidden Marcus from eating dinner because his room wasn't clean to Richard's standards, leaving Marcus hungry through the night and into the next school day. More concerning were entries that explicitly referenced Marcus's thoughts about escape. In a November 2018 entry, Marcus wrote about researching emancipation laws, trying to determine if he could legally separate from his parents before turning 18. The entry noted his frustration at discovering that emancipation required proof of financial independence, which he had no way to achieve while still in high school. A December 2018 entry contained the first reference to suicidal ideation, with Marcus writing, "Sometimes I think about how much easier everything would be if I just didn't exist. Would Dad even care? Or would he just be angry that I took the coward's way out and embarrassed him?" The most chilling entries came from January and February 2019, in the final weeks before the murder. On January 18, 2019, following the choking incident Marcus had mentioned in his interrogation, he wrote, "He put his hands around my throat today. I couldn't breathe. I thought he was actually going to kill me. When he finally let go, he said, 'Remember this feeling next time you think about disobeying me.' I looked at the bruises in the mirror afterward and realized something. He's not going to stop. This is only going to get worse until one of us is dead. And I don't want it to be me." A February 11th entry, just 3 days before the murder, contained what prosecutors would later describe as a murder manifesto, though defense attorneys would argue it was the desperate journal of a trapped and terrified child. Marcus wrote, "I took a knife from the kitchen today and hid it in my desk. I don't know if I'll use it, but I need to have options. I need to feel like I have some control. Dad has been drinking more lately. He's more aggressive when he drinks. Mom leaves for Seattle on Thursday. I know what that means. He'll be worse when she's gone because there's no one to witness it, no one to hear me if I scream. I can't keep living like this. Something has to change. The final entry, written on the morning of February 14th before school, was the one Detective Park had observed on Marcus's desk the night of the murder. Its words would be read aloud in court multiple times. Today is the day everything changes. I can't live like this anymore. He won't stop. He'll never stop. I have to make it stop. I'm sorry for what I'm about to do, but I don't see any other choice. Maybe now Mom will finally be free too. This entry, combined with the fact that Marcus had already secured the murder weapon 3 days earlier, provided overwhelming evidence of premeditation that would make the first-degree murder charge virtually impossible for the defense to overcome. Beyond the journal, investigators examined Marcus's laptop and phone for additional context. His internet search history revealed a troubling pattern of research that supported his claims of desperation, but also demonstrated planning. In the weeks before the murder, Marcus had searched for information about child abuse reporting procedures, emancipation laws in Oregon, and self-defense statutes. He had visited websites for domestic violence resources and suicide prevention hotlines. The record showed he had never actually called any of these numbers. More damning were searches conducted on February 11th, the same day he took the knife. Where to stab someone to kill them quickly? How long does it take to bleed out? And can a teenager go to prison for killing an abusive parent? These searches, discovered by digital forensic specialists, would become central evidence in the prosecution's case. While they demonstrated that Marcus had been researching his situation and potential responses, they also showed that he had specifically researched how to kill effectively, suggesting his intent went beyond self-defense to premeditated murder. Defense attorneys would later argue that a teenager in Marcus's situation, raised in the internet age, would naturally research his options online, and that the searches reflected desperation rather than cold calculation. But the specificity of the queries about stabbing locations and bleeding times would prove difficult to explain away as mere research.
Detective Park's team also interviewed Marcus's teachers at Franklin High School, hoping to determine whether school personnel had observed signs of abuse or concerning behavior that might support Marcus's claims. The picture that emerged was complex and, in many ways, troubling for its suggestion that warning signs had been present but not adequately addressed. Marcus's freshman-year English teacher, Miss Sarah Rodriguez, recalled that Marcus had written several creative pieces that, in retrospect, seemed to contain concerning themes. One short story, written in October 2018, featured a protagonist trapped in a house with a monster that appeared human but revealed its true nature only when alone with the protagonist. "I remember thinking it was very creative," Miss Rodriguez told investigators, her voice heavy with guilt. "The writing was sophisticated, with good use of metaphor and symbolism. I gave him an A on the assignment. But I didn't see it as a cry for help. I didn't recognize that he might be writing about his own life." She provided copies of Marcus's work to investigators, and the parallels between the fictional scenarios Marcus created and his actual home life became increasingly apparent. Another story, written in December 2018, featured a character who killed an oppressive authority figure and then felt nothing but relief, like a weight lifted. Marcus's guidance counselor, Mr. Thomas Brennan, recalled a meeting in November 2018 where Marcus had seemed upset and mentioned having problems at home. When Mr. Brennan had asked Marcus to elaborate, the teenager had been vague, saying only that his father had high expectations and was hard to please. Mr. Brennan had interpreted this as typical teenage frustration with parental rules and expectations, a misreading he would deeply regret. "If I had pushed harder, asked more specific questions, maybe I could have uncovered what was really happening," he told investigators. But Marcus seemed like a well-adjusted, high-achieving student. His grades were good, he wasn't getting in trouble, I didn't see the signs of serious abuse. This failure to recognize and report potential abuse would later spark discussions about mandatory reporter training and the need for educators to look beyond academic performance when assessing student well-being. Several of Marcus's teachers noted that he had seemed increasingly withdrawn and tired during the months leading up to the murder, occasionally falling asleep in class or seeming distracted and distant. But these signs, while concerning, had not risen to the level that triggered intervention or investigation. The fact that Marcus maintained good grades despite his deteriorating home situation actually worked against him in terms of receiving help, as his academic success masked the trauma he was experiencing. Investigators also interviewed Marcus's peers at Franklin High School, though these conversations required parental permission given the students' ages. The portrait that emerged from his classmates was of a quiet, intelligent, artistic boy who had grown increasingly isolated over his freshman year. Marcus's closest friend, Daniel Kim, told investigators that Marcus had become more distant starting around Christmas 2018, declining invitations to hang out and seeming preoccupied during their conversations at school. I asked him a few times if everything was okay. He always said he was fine, just busy with schoolwork, but I could tell something was wrong. He seemed sad, but I didn't know how to help him. One particularly significant interview was with a classmate named Rebecca Martinez, who had worked with Marcus on a group project in their world history class in January 2019. Rebecca told detectives that during one of their after-school work sessions at the public library, Marcus had seemed particularly down and had made a comment that, in hindsight, seemed like a warning sign. He said something like, "Do you ever feel like you're trapped in a situation with no way out?" Rebecca recalled. I thought he was talking about the project because we were having trouble with it. But then he said, "Not the project, life. Like there's this problem that's never going to go away unless you do something drastic." I asked him what he meant, but he just shook his head and changed the subject. Rebecca's testimony would later be used by the defense to support their argument that Marcus had been experiencing genuine psychological distress and feelings of being trapped, consistent with his claims of ongoing abuse. However, the prosecution would point out that Marcus's vague references to problems and his tendency to deflect when pressed for details suggested he was capable of maintaining a facade and deliberately withholding information, characteristics more consistent with manipulation than victimization. The investigation into Richard Chen's background and reputation proved equally complex. As a cardiac surgeon at Oregon Health and Science University, Richard had been highly respected professionally, known for his technical skill and dedication to his patients. Colleagues described him as demanding but brilliant, someone who held himself and others to high standards. Dr. Patricia Wong, who had worked alongside Richard for over a decade, told investigators that Richard was intense and perfectionist, but that she had never witnessed behavior that suggested he might be abusive at home. Richard was very private about his personal life. He rarely talked about his family, and when he did, it was usually in the context of Marcus's academic achievements or extracurricular activities. He seemed proud of his son, at least in the way he presented it to colleagues, but there was a quality to how he talked about Marcus that always struck me as odd. It was very transactional, like Marcus was a project or an investment rather than a child he loved. Other colleagues provided similar observations, describing Richard as someone who seemed to view relationships, including family relationships, through a lens of performance and achievement, rather than emotional connection. One resident who had trained under Richard described him as brutal in his criticism of mistakes, someone who seemed to believe that harsh criticism was the most effective teaching tool. He once told me that if I couldn't handle being called incompetent when I made an error, I shouldn't be in medicine. It was demoralizing, but I told myself he was just trying to make me better. Now I wonder if that's what he told himself about how he treated his son.
The investigation into Richard's personal life revealed additional concerning patterns. Financial records showed that Richard had been seeing a therapist, Dr. Michael Foster, for approximately 6 months before his death. Detective Park obtained a warrant to access these therapy records, which provided crucial insight into Richard's state of mind and behavior. In his sessions with Dr. Foster, Richard had discussed feeling frustrated with Marcus's lack of drive and ambition, expressing disappointment that his son seemed more interested in frivolous artistic pursuits than in preparing for a career in medicine or another prestigious field. More significantly, the therapy notes revealed that Dr. Foster had expressed concern about Richard's described parenting methods, which included rigid control, harsh criticism, and what Richard termed consequences for failing to meet expectations. In one session note from January 2019, Dr. Foster wrote, "Client describes withholding privileges and emotional warmth as motivational techniques. Client seems unable to recognize that his son may respond to different parenting approaches than what client himself experienced growing up. Suggested family therapy multiple times. Client resistant. States his wife is too soft on their son and that family therapy would undermine his authority." These therapy notes would become crucial evidence for the defense, as they documented a pattern of controlling and emotionally abusive behavior that Richard himself had described, even if he hadn't recognized it as problematic. The notes also revealed that Richard had been physically disciplined severely by his own father during childhood, a pattern of intergenerational trauma that might explain, though not excuse, his treatment of Marcus. Dr. Foster's notes indicated he had tried to help Richard understand how his childhood experiences might be influencing his parenting, but Richard had resisted this insight, insisting that strict discipline had made him successful and would do the same for Marcus. Investigators also discovered that Richard had been prescribed alprazolam for anxiety approximately 4 months before his death, around the same time he began therapy. The prescription notes from his physician indicated that Richard had been experiencing work-related stress and anxiety about his family situation, though no specifics were documented. Toxicology reports from the night of the murder showed therapeutic levels of alprazolam in Richard's system, combined with a blood alcohol content of 0.12%, suggesting he had been self-medicating with alcohol in addition to his prescribed medication, a potentially dangerous combination that might have affected his judgment and behavior that evening. Linda Chen's interviews with investigators provided perhaps the most painful and complex testimony in the entire investigation. Marcus's mother, a soft-spoken woman who worked part-time as a piano teacher, was devastated by her husband's death and her son's arrest, caught between grief for one and fear for the other. Her initial statement to police, given on February 15th, just hours after Richard's death, portrayed their family as normal and functional, with Richard being strict but loving, and Marcus being a good kid who sometimes struggled with his father's high expectations. However, as Detective Park conducted follow-up interviews with Linda over the subsequent weeks, a more complicated picture emerged. In a February 22nd interview, after she had time to process the initial shock and review some of the evidence investigators had gathered, Linda began to acknowledge aspects of Richard's behavior that she had previously minimized or rationalized. "I knew Richard could be harsh with Marcus," her voice barely above a whisper. "I told myself it was cultural, that in Chinese families fathers are expected to be strict and demanding. My own father was that way. I thought it was normal, that it would make Marcus stronger and more successful." As Detective Park pressed gently for more specific information, Linda revealed incidents she had witnessed but not intervened in, situations she now recognized as abusive but had reframed as discipline at the time. She described Richard refusing to speak to Marcus for days at a time as punishment for perceived failures, a form of emotional abuse through silence and withdrawal of affection. She recalled Richard forcing Marcus to spend entire weekends studying, with breaks only for meals and bathroom use, while Richard stood over him, monitoring his work. She remembered Richard destroying Marcus's artwork on multiple occasions when he felt Marcus was spending too much time on art instead of academics, including burning a portfolio of drawings Marcus had created for a school competition. "Why didn't you stop him?" Detective Park asked, a question Linda had clearly been asking herself repeatedly since her son's arrest. Linda's answer was complex and painful. I was afraid of him, too. Not physically. He never hit me. But there was this way he had of making you feel worthless with just his words and his silence. If I tried to defend Marcus or suggest Richard was being too hard on him, Richard would turn that coldness on me. He'd tell me I was undermining him, that I was making Marcus weak, that I was a bad mother for not supporting his efforts to prepare our son for success. It was easier to tell myself Richard was right, that he knew best because he was successful, and I wasn't. It was easier to stand up to him. This testimony would prove crucial, but also problematic for the defense. On one hand, it corroborated Marcus's claims of living in an abusive household with a controlling, emotionally cruel father. On the other hand, it raised questions about why neither Linda nor Marcus had sought help from the authorities, and whether Marcus had truly exhausted all other options before resorting to murder. The prosecution would argue that Marcus could have told his mother how bad things really were, could have reported the abuse to school officials or police, could have run away or sought help from extended family. The defense would counter that victims of long-term abuse often feel trapped and hopeless, unable to see alternatives that might seem obvious to outside observers. Medical records provided additional corroborating evidence of abuse. Emergency room visits documented in Marcus's medical history included a broken finger at age 12, explained at the time as a basketball injury, a sprained wrist at age 13, attributed to a fall from a bicycle, and bruised ribs at age 14, described as occurring during a soccer game. While none of these injuries had triggered mandatory abuse reporting, when viewed collectively and in light of Marcus's testimony, they formed a pattern consistent with physical abuse that had been carefully concealed through plausible alternative explanations. Dr. Emma Peterson, Marcus's pediatrician, told investigators she had seen Marcus for routine checkups annually, but had never suspected abuse. Marcus was always polite and cooperative during examinations, Dr. Peterson recalled. His parents seemed attentive and concerned about his health. The injuries he sustained over the years all had reasonable explanations, and Marcus corroborated those explanations when I asked about them. If he was being abused, he hid it well, or I failed to see the signs, probably both. The physical evidence from the Chen home was processed meticulously by forensics teams, yielding details that both supported and complicated Marcus's narrative. The living room crime scene showed evidence consistent with Marcus's description of the murder. Blood spatter patterns indicated Richard had been moving backward, away from his attacker, when many of the wounds were inflicted. Defensive wounds on Richard's hands and forearms suggested he had tried to protect himself and grabbed the knife. The position of Richard's body, near the coffee table where Marcus said his father had stumbled, matched Marcus's account. However, forensic analysis also revealed details that troubled investigators. The number and severity of the stab wounds, 7 in total, with several showing significant force behind them, suggested a level of sustained violence that went beyond a single panicked moment of self-defense. Dr. James Harrison, the forensic pathologist who conducted Richard Chen's autopsy, noted that while some wounds appeared to have been inflicted during the struggle Marcus described, others, including the fatal chest wound, were delivered with the victim already on the ground and likely incapacitated. The angle and depth of the final wounds suggest the victim was supine, lying on his back when they were inflicted, Dr. Harrison testified in his preliminary report. This is more consistent with a sustained assault than with defensive actions. The knife itself, once processed, bore Marcus's fingerprints and Richard's blood, with no evidence of Richard's fingerprints on the handle, supporting Marcus's claim that he had been the sole wielder of the weapon. The blade, a 10-inch chef's knife from the Chen family's kitchen set, was of good quality and very sharp, capable of inflicting deep wounds with moderate force. Forensic experts determined that the fatal wound to Richard's heart had been delivered with significant force, penetrating the sternum partially before entering the heart, suggesting determination rather than wild, panicked stabbing. Perhaps most significantly, investigators found Marcus's blood-soaked clothes from the night of the murder in a plastic trash bag in his closet, as he had indicated during his interrogation. The clothes had not been washed or destroyed, and they contained both Marcus's and Richard's blood. Analysis showed that the blood distribution pattern on the clothes was consistent with Marcus's description of straddling his father on the floor during the final moments of the attack, with blood from Richard's wounds soaking into Marcus's clothing during those final stabs. The knife's original location, hidden in Marcus's desk drawer for 3 days before the murder, was confirmed through interviews with Linda Chen. She told investigators that she had noticed a knife missing from their kitchen block earlier that week, but had assumed it was simply misplaced or in the dishwasher. She had not searched Marcus's room for it, as she had no reason to suspect her son would have taken it. This 3-day gap between taking the knife and using it would prove crucial in establishing premeditation, as it demonstrated that Marcus had time to consider his actions, to change his mind, to seek help, but instead had kept the weapon hidden until an opportunity to use it presented itself. As the investigation reached its 6-week mark in late March 2019, Detective Park compiled her findings into a comprehensive report that would guide the prosecution's case. The evidence overwhelmingly supported charging Marcus Chen with first-degree murder. Premeditation was established through the journal entries, internet searches, and advanced securing of the weapon. Intent was demonstrated through the specific research about how to kill effectively and the sustained nature of the attack, and the absence of immediate threat was indicated by forensic evidence showing continued stabbing of a victim who was already incapacitated and on the ground. However, the investigation had also uncovered substantial evidence of long-term abuse that provided context for Marcus's actions, even if that context didn't legally justify them. The challenge for prosecutors would be acknowledging this abuse while still holding Marcus accountable for choosing murder over other options. The challenge for the defense would be using the abuse evidence to generate sympathy for Marcus while explaining away the premeditation and calculation that characterized his actions. As both sides prepared for the legal battle ahead, one fundamental question remained unresolved. At what point does a victim of abuse become a perpetrator of murder? And how should the justice system respond when that transformation occurs in a 15-year-old child?
On September 3, 2019, nearly 7 months after the murder of Dr. Richard Chen, his son Marcus entered the Multnomah County Circuit Court for the beginning of what would become one of Oregon's most controversial juvenile justice cases. The intervening months had been consumed by legal maneuvering over a single crucial question: should Marcus be tried as an adult or remain in the juvenile system? The decision, ultimately made by Judge Caroline Webster after extensive hearings, was that Marcus would be tried as an adult, given the premeditated nature of his crime and the severity of the charges, but with special consideration given to his age during sentencing, should he be convicted. This compromise satisfied no one fully. Victims' rights advocates and Richard Chen's extended family argued that Marcus's calculated planning and lack of remorse warranted full adult treatment, including the possibility of life without parole. Child welfare advocates and abuse survivors groups countered that Marcus's background of abuse and his neurologically immature adolescent brain made adult prosecution fundamentally unjust. Judge Webster, in her written opinion explaining her decision, acknowledged the difficulty. This court recognizes that Marcus Chen is both a victim and a perpetrator, and that our justice system struggles to accommodate this duality. However, the deliberate nature of his actions requires that he face adult consequences, tempered by recognition of his youth. The courtroom on opening day was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds directed to auxiliary rooms where the proceedings would be broadcast on closed-circuit television.
Marcus, now 16 years old after spending his 15th birthday in juvenile detention, sat at the defense table wearing a button-down shirt and slacks that his mother had brought for him, clothes that emphasized his youth and slight build. His hair had grown longer during his incarceration, falling over his eyes in a way that made him appear even younger and more vulnerable. Beside him sat his defense team, led by Jennifer Hartman, the public defender who had represented him since the night of his arrest, now joined by 2 additional attorneys whose expertise in both juvenile law and abuse victim defense would prove crucial to their strategy. The prosecution team was led by District Attorney Michael Sullivan, a veteran prosecutor known for his aggressive approach to violent crime and his particular focus on holding juvenile offenders accountable. Sullivan had built his political career on a tough-on-crime platform that resisted what he termed the excuse culture in criminal justice. His decision to personally prosecute the Chen case, rather than delegating it to one of his deputies, signaled the importance he placed on securing a conviction that would send a message about personal responsibility and the limits of abuse as a defense for murder. Assisting Sullivan were 2 experienced trial attorneys whose combined expertise in forensic evidence and juvenile psychology would be deployed to counter the defense's narrative of Marcus as a desperate victim. Judge Caroline Webster, a 62-year-old jurist with over 20 years on the bench, brought a reputation for fairness, but also for strict adherence to legal procedure and intolerance for emotional appeals not grounded in admissible evidence. Her decision to allow cameras in the courtroom, controversial given the defendant's age, reflected her belief in transparency and public accountability in cases of significant public interest. However, she imposed strict rules about filming Marcus directly, allowing only angles that showed him from behind or in profile, a compromise intended to protect some measure of his privacy while still permitting public observation of the proceedings. Jury selection had consumed 2 full weeks in August, with both sides carefully vetting potential jurors for their views on child abuse, self-defense, parental rights, and juvenile justice. The final jury of 12, plus 4 alternates, consisted of 7 women and 5 men, ranging in age from 26 to 68. None had personal experience with severe child abuse, though several had children of their own, a factor the defense hoped would make them more sympathetic to Marcus's situation. 3 jurors had medical backgrounds, which both sides viewed as potentially beneficial to their cases. The prosecution believed medical professionals would understand the severity of Richard's injuries and the sustained nature of the attack, while the defense hoped they would grasp the psychological trauma Marcus had experienced. Prosecutor Michael Sullivan's opening statement set the tone for the state's case with stark simplicity. "This is a case about murder," he began, standing directly in front of the jury box to establish immediate connection with the jurors. Not self-defense, not an accident, not a momentary loss of control. Murder. Planned, deliberate, calculated murder of a father by his son. Sullivan methodically outlined the evidence of premeditation that would be presented. Marcus's journal entries expressing intent to kill his father, his internet searches about how to effectively stab someone, his advance acquisition and concealment of the murder weapon, and his own admission during police interrogation that he had decided his father needed to die. "The defense will tell you a story," Sullivan continued, his voice taking on a tone of anticipated dismissal. "They will tell you about a difficult father, about high expectations and harsh words. They will try to make you forget that thousands, tens of thousands of teenagers across this country live with strict parents, with parents who are sometimes cruel, with parents who disappoint and hurt them. And yet these teenagers don't kill their parents. They find other ways to cope. They seek help. They endure until they can leave. They do anything except what Marcus Chen did, which was to plan and execute a murder."
Sullivan used a large presentation screen to display selected excerpts from Marcus's journal, emphasizing phrases that suggested premeditation and calculation rather than desperate self-defense. He showed the jury Marcus's internet search history, letting the stark words hang in the courtroom. Where to stab someone to kill them quickly. He described how Marcus had hidden a knife in his room for 3 days, waiting for the right moment, and how he had deceived his father by pretending to comply with his demands while secretly retrieving the weapon he intended to use. Marcus Chan wants you to believe he had no choice, Sullivan concluded, his voice rising with emotion that seemed calculated for maximum impact. But he had many choices. He could have told his mother the full extent of what was happening. He could have reported abuse to school counselors, to police, to any of the mandatory reporters in his life. He could have run away, called a hotline, reached out to extended family. Instead, he chose murder. He chose to take a knife and hide it in his room. He researched what he felt he needed to know, and he approached his father and stabbed him 7 times, including delivering a final, fatal wound to the chest while his father lay bleeding on the floor. That is not self-defense. That is not a child with no options. That is murder, and it deserves to be punished as such. The prosecution's opening statement lasted 45 minutes and left many in the courtroom nodding in agreement, the logical progression of Sullivan's argument difficult to refute on its face. Richard Chen's family members, seated in the gallery behind the prosecution table, sat with grim satisfaction, while Linda Chen, isolated on the defense side, wept quietly into a tissue. Marcus himself showed little visible reaction to the prosecutor's words, his expression remaining neutral and somewhat distant, a demeanor that concerned his defense team, as it might be interpreted by jurors as indicating lack of remorse or emotional disconnect. Jennifer Hartman's opening statement for the defense took a fundamentally different approach, beginning not with the crime, but with Marcus's childhood. "Imagine being a child," she said, softly, her voice requiring jurors to lean forward and listen intently. "And the person who is supposed to protect you, to love you, to make you feel safe, is instead the source of your greatest fear. Imagine going to school each day, knowing that when you return home, you will face criticism, control, and cruelty. Imagine that no matter how hard you try, how perfectly you perform, it is never enough. You are always disappointing, always defective, always a failure in the eyes of the one person whose approval you desperately need." Hartman spent the first 20 minutes of her opening statement painting a picture of Marcus's life under Richard Chen's control, using evidence from the investigation to establish a pattern of escalating abuse that had left Marcus feeling trapped and hopeless. She described the verbal degradation, the impossible standards, the physical intimidation, and the isolation tactics that had characterized Marcus's teenage years. She showed the jury photos of bruises documented in medical records, though she acknowledged that these had been explained away at the time with plausible alternative stories. "The prosecution is right about one thing," Hartman continued, her voice gaining strength. "Marcus did plan this. He did take that knife and hide it. He did research what he felt he needed to know. But the question we need to ask is not whether Marcus planned this, but why. What drives a 15-year-old boy, a child with good grades and artistic talent and friends, to believe that his only option is to kill his own father? The answer is years of abuse so severe, so relentless, so completely encompassing, that Marcus genuinely believed he would not survive to adulthood if his father continued to live." The defense strategy became clear as Hartman outlined the testimony and evidence they would present. Expert witnesses in child psychology and trauma who would explain how chronic abuse affects adolescent brain development and decision-making. Testimony from Linda Chen about the abuse she had witnessed but failed to stop. Marcus's journal entries showing his desperate search for alternatives before concluding that murder was his only option. And ultimately, Marcus's own testimony, describing in his own words what it was like to live under Richard Chen's roof and what led him to believe that killing his father was an act of survival rather than an act of murder. At the end of this trial, Hartman concluded, looking directly at each juror in turn, you will be asked to make a decision about Marcus Chen. The prosecution wants you to see him as a cold-blooded killer
who deserves to die in prison. We ask you to see him as what he truly is, a child who was pushed beyond his breaking point, who made a terrible decision in a moment of desperation, and who deserves not just punishment, but also compassion and a chance at rehabilitation. The law recognizes that children are different from adults, that their brains are not fully developed, that they are more susceptible to trauma and less capable of managing extreme stress. Marcus Chen is proof of why those laws exist. The contrast between the two opening statements could not have been more stark, and the trial that followed would essentially be a battle between these two competing narratives. Was Marcus a calculated killer or a desperate victim? The answer would determine not just the verdict, but the trajectory of the rest of Marcus's life.